If you're a football fan, you've probably heard the name Junior Seau. He was a passionate, fist-pumping, emotional leader and a superstar in the NFL. He played 13 years for the San Diego Chargers, and then 3 years with the Miami Dolphins, and then finally 4 years with the New England Patriots. 20 years in the NFL. He made the Pro Bowl 12 times in that 20 years and was selected to the NFL's all-decade team for the 1990s. In other words, he was one of the premier superstars in the NFL for an entire decade. To most people, it seemed like Junior Seau had everything. That is, until his sudden death on May 12th, 2012, when he took his own life. In an interview with Sports Illustrated, his former teammate and friend, Rodney Harrison, explained that in the last days of Seau's life, he was desperately searching for peace. Harrison said he would tell me the only time he really felt at peace when he was with his children or when he was out in the surf on a surfboard. Junior Seau was from Hawaii, I believe, and had learned to surf at an early age. He told Harrison, when I'm on those waves, it's the greatest feeling. I have no worries, no stress, no problems. I just forget about everything. And then Harrison said Junior Seau was always searching for peace, but could never seem to find it. His life and his death proves one thing that's common to all humanity, and that is that we're all searching for peace. But we won't find that peace in success or fame. Even the world's most successful people still have a deep spiritual hunger, that void within them that cries out for something to fill it. The only problem is some people never figure out that it can only be satisfied by Jesus Christ. The type of peace that we really need can only come from God and our faith in His power and in His grace. We're in the 4th week of a message series that I've been calling Victorious Living, looking at what the Bible calls the fruit of the Spirit. And in this series, I've been trying to see what this fruit of the Spirit is and how you can use it in that battle that we all fight between good and evil, or between the flesh and the Spirit. How to live that victorious life as God intended you to live. A life that's truly pleasing to God. And we've already looked at a couple of aspects of the fruit of the Spirit found in a passage in Galatians 5. We looked at we looked at love, then joy. And today we're going to continue through Paul's list of attributes of fruit of the Spirit as we look at peace. As in the past weeks, we're going to start off with Galatians 5, just verses 22 and 23 to get you kind of grounded in this as our jumping off point. Paul says, "But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Against such things there is no law." Now the real question for today becomes then, what is this thing that we call peace? It can mean a lot of different things if you look it up in the dictionary. It can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people, depending on their outlook on life. But I want us to look at biblical peace and try to determine where that comes from and how we can obtain it. And the first point I want to get across to you today is I think real peace starts when we obtain peace with God. In other words, on a personal level. Our natural human condition is really a state of being in rebellion against God, against His laws, against His Word. We don't like to think of it that way. We don't like to admit that that's the way we are. We certainly don't like to think that even little children that are born into this world in that state. But just use your brain power for a minute. Even when they're little, do you have to teach them to obey, or do you have to teach them to disobey? Which one comes naturally? They know how to disobey, don't they? They know how to get prideful and arrogant and stubborn without anybody teaching them. What we have to do as parents and grandparents and aunts and uncles and neighbors and teachers is we have to begin to teach them how to love God and to obey His Word. We're born in the sinful state. That's all there is to it. You may not like to accept it, but that's the reality of life. It's been true ever since Adam and Eve ate the fruit from the forbidden tree in the garden, and it's still true today. The peace, then, with God begins when we accept the fact that we're sinners and that we're sinners in need of a Savior. That's what Paul talked about in Romans 5:1 when he said, "Since we have been justified through faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ." Now let me talk about that a minute. We're justified in God's eyes. In other words, we're made righteous in God's eyes, not because of anything we've done, but only because what Christ has already done for us. You've got to get that straight in your mind. You can't earn your way into heaven. You can't buy your way into heaven. You can't get in on your good looks or your money or your fame or your fortune. Only through grace that you obtain by faith in who Jesus Christ really is. And then that peace begins. It's almost like that's the treaty signing between us and God. War ceases between Him and us. And we agree to live at peace with Him and He with us. Then that peace, just like with any treaty, has to begin to grow if it's going to mean anything real in your life. And it grows as we begin to be more and more like Christ and begin to live our life more and more in obedience to His commands. We don't start out very well when we're a Christian, do we? When we're a baby Christian. We don't know enough about God and about His laws and His ways and His will. And so we falter and we stumble and we fall. And sometimes we plunge headlong thinking we were doing the right thing and we end up doing the wrong thing. But at least our heart's in the right place. Psalm 119, though, I think it's the longest psalm in your Bible. In verse 165 has something very significant to say about the peace that we need to grow in. It says, "Great peace have they who love your law, and nothing can make them stumble." Now, do you understand what the psalmist is saying there? If you begin to understand God's law and make it part of your life, and you begin to love it as the way you want to live your life, then God gives you great peace. And the more you move in that direction, the less likely you are to stumble. The more you are likely to stay on the right path. I can look out in this sanctuary and see some people that have traveled that road, and they've pretty much got it down by now. I'm not saying they're perfect. Nobody is. But they're about as close to perfect as you're going to get in this life. They don't yell at people. They don't doubt God and His power. They don't doubt Him when they're in the midst of a crisis. In fact, they draw closer to Him. They've learned through the years how to walk with God and not get ahead of Him and not fall behind Him. That's where we all need to be. And sometimes that only comes with a lifetime of experience and a lifetime of loving God and loving His Word. I got a long way to go. Hopefully I've got enough time to get there. I told you some of my downfalls last week, probably more than some of you wanted to hear. Hope that doesn't make you too disappointed with me. My point last week was not to pat myself on the back and say, look how far I've come. No, 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 no. What I wanted you to see is look how bad I was. So that you could see that no matter who you run into, no matter who you meet, no matter how bad their situation looks, there is hope. And God can do a lot if we'll just let Him. Being at peace with God, though, can pay some very big dividends. We don't think about it that way all the time, but it's true. And I looked for a verse that I thought captured that, and I think Proverbs 16, verse 7 probably says it about as well as any place in the Bible. It says, when a man's ways are pleasing to the Lord, He makes even his enemies live at peace with him. Now that's pretty cool if you stop and think about it. Most of us are able to live at peace with our friends and our relatives, at least most of the time. I know around Christmas or Thanksgiving, maybe it might get a little tense around the house when folks have been there for just a few days too long, or you've been at their house for just a few days too long. But this is saying even your enemies will live at peace with you. Now the question I had when I read that is, it says, He makes His enemies live at peace with Him. And I said, is He talking about the man whose ways are pleasing to the Lord, or is He talking about the Lord? Which one is the He? And I had to do a little digging and a little thinking and a little deductive reasoning, and I'm not sure, but I think the He, when it says He makes even His enemies live at peace with Him, I think the He there is God. God makes your enemies live at peace with you. And I came to that conclusion because of some other passages in the Bible that illustrate that. If you look over in 2 Chronicles chapter 14, verses 6 and 7, you see that they're talking about a king that ruled over Judah named Asa. He ruled over the southern kingdom for a number of years. And Asa was one of those few really righteous, really in touch with God type of kings. And he was sold out to God all the way, mind, body, and soul. And he led his nation to do likewise. He led his people by example and encouraged them, and he commanded them to celebrate all of the feast and the ordinances of God. And so in 2 Chronicles we find that in the time of Asa, God caused a time of peace over all of Israel. They weren't at war with anybody. And it allowed them to spend all of their strength and their energy and their finances in just growing crops and prospering and building up their cities and fortifying them more, because sooner or later war would come again. But it allowed them to concentrate on the matters at home. And it was very clear in that passage that God was the one that made the enemies be at peace with Israel. Not something Asa did, but God did it because of what Asa did, the way he led. And then just about 3 chapters over, we see another example with a guy, I've always loved this name, Jehoshaphat. He must have jumped a lot, because now we say jumping Jehoshaphat. I don't know where that came from. But he was another of those kings that ruled over the southern kingdom in Judah. And again, he made the people read the God's Word and study the Word and let that become part of their life and their lifestyle. And once again, they were at so much peace with their neighbors, even the ones that didn't like them, that not only were they at peace, but they brought tribute to Judah. It says the Philistines brought silver and gold and cattle and gave them to King Jehoshaphat. Now, that's pretty cool. I can't think of even once when one of my enemies, and I've had a few enemies in the past, I can't think of once where somebody brought me something like that. I'd be glad to take it, by the way, if somebody brought me gold and sheep and cattle and silver. I don't know about sheep, but at least the cattle. Sheep are messy and smelly. But the idea here is that God causes the peace in your life if you're at peace with Him. That's pretty good. That's a pretty good deal for all of us. The second point I want you to get today is real peace with God leads us to have peace with others. It's kind of a natural outflow or byproduct of the peace with God. Because peace with God requires us to be in right relationship with Him, right? If you're not in right relationship with Him, you're not at peace with Him. It kind of comes with the territory. And to be in right relationship with God, you've got to be obeying His law and His will in your life. And if you're doing that, then what's the great commandment? Love God and love your neighbor. So you've got to be at peace with your neighbors. It kind of just logically follows one to the next. And that type of peace certainly applies to the individual. If you don't go around picking fights all the time, you're a lot less likely to end up in fights all the time. Some of you spouses ought to be saying, yep. If I don't pick a fight with Lynn, I usually don't get a fight back. But if I want to get into it, she'll get into it with me. I'm not saying that to knock her. We're just human. But not only does that kind of peace flow to the individual, it can apply to an entire nation. And I just told you a couple of examples of that with Asa and with Jehoshaphat. The king was in right relationship, and therefore that right relationship flowed out to the people, and then that flowed out to the other nations, and everybody was at peace with one another. There's another example, though, in Psalm 85, verse 8. I thought this was a good example. I think this is probably a psalm, can't be sure about this, but probably after the Israelites returned from exile in Babylon. Nehemiah and Ezra and those guys, when they come back to rebuild Jerusalem and rebuild the walls and rebuild the towns after everything had been destroyed. The psalmist says, I will listen to what God the Lord will say. He promises peace to His people, His saints. Now that's plural, His people and His saints. So He's talking about the entire nation, the people of God. The word used there for peace, because there's different words in Hebrew that can mean peace, is the same word used over in Leviticus chapter 26, verse 6, where God promised peace and blessing to the Hebrews in the promised land if they remained in obedience to His word. There's always that if, isn't there? That was a promise to the entire nation, not just to the king or not just to the priest, but to the entire nation of Israel. I think peacefulness then with others should be a distinguishing characteristics for the people of God. It should be one of the defining characteristics that we all share. We have peace with God and we have peace with others. And James, the brother of Jesus, wrote about that in chapter 3, starting in verse 17, and he said this: the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. Peacemakers who sow in peace, in other words, sow in peace with others, raise a harvest of righteousness. Now stop and think about that passage a minute. What is James talking about there? He starts off talking about wisdom being pure because it comes from heaven. But then he talks about being peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. Those are all attributes that help us to be at peace with others. So really that whole passage there he's talking about, if you're wise with the wisdom that comes from heaven, you will have these attributes in your life. You will work to instill them in your daily walk and to use them in your dealings with others. You'll be submissive with others. You'll be considerate. You'll be full of mercy. You'll show good fruit. You'll be impartial. You'll be sincere. You do all those things, it's pretty hard not to be at peace with others unless they're just really determined to get in a fight with you. And I know out in the world there are some people that just want to do that. We read about them in the papers and we see them on the 6 o'clock news. But for the most part, most people don't like to get in altercations and get in fights and get in arguments. Most of us would rather run away than deal with that stuff, wouldn't we? Paul talked about it as well in his final words to the church at Corinth. And he linked this idea of peace with God with the idea of peace with others. He put both together and showed how they were related. He wrote to them in 2 Corinthians 13, verse 11, towards the end of his last letter to the Corinthians. Aim for perfection. Listen to my appeal. Be of one mind. Live in peace. And the God of love and peace will be with you. Now, did you catch what he's saying there? When he's saying be of one mind and live in peace with one another, he's kind of saying the same thing. Get along with others. And then he says, and then the God of peace will be with you. He's linking peace with God and peace with others together. He's trying to make sure that these Corinthians didn't miss it. Now, why the Corinthians? You know about that church at Corinth, don't you? They were just a little bit messed up, or maybe a lot messed up. They had divisions and factions and infighting and backbiting and backstabbing and everything else. And some thought they were more holy than others because they had certain spiritual gifts, and others thought they were more holy because they had other spiritual gifts. And all they were was just a grumbling group of folks that all had a holier-than-thou attitude. Thank God that doesn't happen in churches anymore. Or maybe it does. Maybe, just maybe. But Paul wanted these people that couldn't quite seem to get it straightened out. He wanted them to get it that if you'll get at peace with God and live at peace with others, everything else will kind of smooth out. Life will be better and get better. One of his last big thoughts in the letter to 2 Corinthians that we call 2 Corinthians. The third point I want you to get today is that peace with God and peace with others eventually leads to internal peace. That peace that I think Junior Seau was trying to find but just never could. And I don't want to pick on him. I think there's a lot of people in the world just like Junior that are desperately seeking for peace. And for some reason, even though they've been told about it and it's all over the TV and all over the news and all over the radio and all over the newspapers and all over the Bibles in this world, they can't figure out where to go find that peace. It's a little amazing to me today that people that are really seeking peace, searching for peace, can't find it. And they try all kinds of goofy stuff. Transcendental meditation. I'm not saying there's not some benefits in that. Maybe there is if you could completely clean your mind. I don't know how you do that, but maybe you can become a little more focused and a little more at peace. I don't think it'll last very long. People try yoga. They try all kinds of things, but they keep having to come back and come back and come back and come back day after day after day because the peace they find in those worldly things just don't last. It doesn't stick when the crisis occurs. They have to start over and over and over. I think people that know God and know His Son Jesus Christ have internal peace because they get to the point where they accept that God is in control no matter what. And there's peace in that. If you're in the midst of a crisis, you know that's sometimes the only peace there is. It's the kind of peace that I think Paul was talking about when he said, I have learned to be content in every situation. Paul wrote that while he was in prison. And yet he said he learned to be content. I think he's saying, I've learned to be at peace with the world, at peace with myself, at peace with God, even in the midst of trials and tribulations. Isn't that what we all want in our life? To learn to be content regardless of the situation, knowing that God's got it under control, even if we don't understand it? I know that's where I want to be. Sometimes it's a battle trying to get back over there when I've drifted off a little bit. But I know that that's the direction I need to go in, not run the other way. And the bigger the trial, the bigger the crisis, the faster you need to run the other direction back towards God. That same kind of peace and contentment internally, I think, is the same thing that was written about by that great Old Testament prophet Isaiah. Wrote one of the longest prophetic books in the Bible. And in Isaiah 26, verse 3, he says, you, meaning God, he's talking to God there, will keep in perfect peace him whose mind is steadfast because he trusts in you. Trust in the Lord forever, for the Lord is the rock eternal. What he's saying is God is what we should keep our mind focused on. We should be steadfast on that idea that he's God and he's in control all the time, no matter what. And I think what he's saying is when you can do that, then you're at peace with God, and then that'll help you to be at peace with others, regardless of what's going on around you. Because you know God's always in control and always faithful. Paul talked about that same kind of internal peace too over in Philippians chapter 4, verses 4 through 7. He said, rejoice in the Lord always. I will say it again, rejoice. Let your gentleness be evident to all. The Lord is near. Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your request to God. And then here's the neat part. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Now, I think what he's saying there is it's all about your attitudes and your actions if you want peace in your life. He's saying if you're gentle in your dealings with others, and if you placed all your confidence and your trust in God's power and mercy, and if you have a spirit of thankfulness, see, those are all things that God teaches us to do, then you'll acquire that sense of peace that only God can give, that sense of peace that surpasses all understanding. And that's the kind of peace, it's the only kind of peace that will prevail even over the chaos of this mixed up world. Now, having that kind of peace in your life, having that kind of trust and confidence in a great and loving God, gives us the assurance that everything's all right, even when it doesn't seem like it. And it tells us that it'll be all right now, but it'll be all right in the future as well. Jesus himself talked about the idea of future blessings flowing out of the peace that we now have in what we call today the Beatitudes. It's a little heading in your Bible now. It wasn't there when Jesus spoke the words. It just was inserted by an editor in Matthew chapter 5. And in verse 9, Jesus said, blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the sons of God. Now, let me put that in modern English. They'll be called the sons and daughters of God. I don't want to leave the ladies out. What Jesus was saying is those that remain at peace with God and peace with others are the ones that God will definitely claim as his own when they stand before his judgment seat one day. And Jesus Christ sits on that seat. And he's going to say, Father, this one's with me. He goes over with the sheep. He's one of the faithful. I don't know about you, but that's the words I hope I hear. Because I don't want to be thrown in with the goats. They're just going to a big barbecue. And it's not going to be any fun for anybody. I would much rather stand before the judgment seat and hear God accept me one day and recognize me as one of His own, knowing that I was bought with a price and dearly loved. Now, while I was preparing this message this week, I ran across two articles or stories that both illustrate this human desire for peace that I think is pretty much universal. I think everybody in one way or another is looking for their own version of peace. But these two stories describe two diametrically opposed methods for achieving peace in our lives. In the first article, it was really more of an article than a story. A lady named Lisa Miller was talking about depression. And all of us can get depressed from time to time, and some people can even suffer from what they call clinical depression. And she wasn't making light of that. She acknowledged that there is such a thing as real clinical depression, and sometimes you have to take medicines to kind of jumpstart your system and get some counseling to kind of work your way out of that. She acknowledged that as a very real threat in our lives if it's not dealt with. It's the kind of depression that can make people do crazy things, sometimes even end their own life or take the lives of others. But her article was really more focused on a different type of oppression that she just called low-grade anxiety. Or she called it functional anxiety. And what she was talking about was just the everyday annoyances in life and the disturbances that we have to deal with. And the point of her article was that people were using drugs today not to deal with the big stuff that they need medical help with, but to deal with the everyday ups and downs of life, the stuff that we all deal with all the time. It's kind of a wake-up call. She said, if the 90s were the decade of Prozac, and they were, trust me, Prozac was the drug of choice in the 90s, then the early part of the 21st century is the era of Xanax. You've probably heard that medicine mentioned on TV in an ad. In her article, though, Lisa Miller explained how people are turning more and more to pills as the means of obtaining peace, even for common, ordinary problems that you should logically be able to deal with and work through. And she was saying that we're losing that ability as a nation to just cope with everyday stresses because everybody just take a pill. Just take another pill. Just take another pill. Just take another pill. They call Xanax the chill pill. You get up a little upset about something, the red light took too long to turn green, take a Xanax. Didn't have a particularly good day at work today, take a Xanax. Your wife's not in a good mood when you get home, take another Xanax. Just pop them like candy. And you'll just mellow out. No problem. Only problem is you have to keep taking those things and taking those things and taking those things. You can see where that leads over the long course, can't you? She said that it had gotten so prevalent in our society now. I didn't know this. Nobody's been offering me these things, but people pass them out at parties and gatherings at their houses. If somebody else says, oh, I'm a little stressed. Oh, here, just take one of my pills. No thought to whether that might be good for them or not. Pass them out like mints to their friends. Somebody's afraid that they might get laid off at work. Oh, just take a pill. That's not going to stop the layoff. And if you do get laid off, it's not going to make you feel any better afterwards. It just chills you out for a few minutes. Somebody has a little relationship problem, boyfriend, girlfriend, spouse. Just take a pill. Everything will be fine. Somebody's got the in-laws coming for Christmas and they're going to be there for 2 weeks. Oh, take a whole bunch of those pills. Right? Not my in-laws. I live with them. They live with me. There aren't enough pills in the world. We just have to learn to live and get along together. And I'm most of the problem anyway, so they'd probably like to give me lithium or something sometimes. She cited one man that she interviewed in this study she was doing that admitted to being desperate for a Xanax when he travels for business. And then listen to what he said. He doesn't usually take the pills. He's just got to know that they're there. What a nation of wimps we're becoming if that's what we've been reduced to. I can't go to sleep. I can't go out of town if I don't have a pill with me. Now, I know there are some people that definitely need medications for their conditions. Don't get me wrong. I'm talking about just the rank and file of us that just had a little bit of a bad day, and we think we've got to run down to the doctor and get a prescription just so we don't feel anything anymore. That's stupid. God gave you feelings for a reason. Pain sometimes motivates you to make a change. Unhappiness sometimes motivates you to do something to become more happy instead of just drugging it down with medication. Now contrast that pill-popping approach to the approach I found in the second article that I read that was in Time magazine. I was kind of surprised Time printed this, but once in a while they surprise me. This article was about a nun. It didn't say why, but for some reason she was the only one left at her convent. I think it was out in California somewhere, over an extended weekend, like a 3-day weekend. All the rest of them had gone. Maybe they went to Disney World or something. I don't know. Have you ever seen nuns in Disney World? I have. It's weird at first, but then you realize, well, they're human and they're just trying to have a good time, and there's nothing inherently wrong with Disney World. But everybody was gone starting that Friday afternoon for Saturday, Sunday, and Monday. And she was going to be the only one in the whole premises. Don't you know that must be kind of lonely? She got on the elevator, and then the unthinkable happened. The power went out while she was between floors. She tried to push the doors open. I was trying to picture that. I just thought that was probably pretty pitiful. But they were stuck solid. She couldn't budge them. She tried calling out with her cell phone. I didn't know nuns had cell phones, but I guess they do in this day and age. But you know how it is in an elevator, right? You can't get a signal, especially inside the stone walls of the monastery. For a brief moment, she said, panic really did begin to set in. She lost all sense of peace that she had had. But then her faith kicked in and her peace started to creep back in. And she realized that she had just come from the kitchen, and she just happened to have a small container of water and some celery sticks. That wouldn't give me much peace. A pizza maybe, but not celery sticks. And a few cough drops. What a menu, right? Water, celery, and cough drops. And she knew at that point she had a choice. She could either panic or she could pray. And she chose to see this experience as a gift from God, where she could pray and draw closer to Him and feel His presence even inside that elevator. Now imagine that, 3 days in that elevator before somebody came to get her. Maybe you've just come through a crisis where you needed to feel God's peace. Maybe you're in one of those crises right now. Or maybe you'll be in one at some point in the future. If you live long enough, another one's going to come along, right? Big or small, there's going to be something that's going to flare up in your life unexpectedly. Either way, peace is available to you just like it was for that nun. And you start that process by making peace with God and accepting His grace in your life through Jesus Christ. and then living in obedience to His Word. That's the starting point. And then you help that to grow in your life by striving to live at peace with others in your daily Christian walk. Now, you're not always going to succeed because sometimes they don't want to be at peace with you. But you strive as much as possible to live at peace with others. And that peace grows in your life. And then you achieve that internal peace that only God can give, that peace that passes all understanding, because you're doing number 1 and number 2 right. And then you can be content and at peace regardless of your circumstances or surroundings, even if you're stuck in an elevator for 3 days. Let's go to the Lord in prayer.